How many of you are criminal justice major? Okay, some. How many of you are interested in the racial and ethnic disparities in the criminal justice system? Good. That's what I was hoping for. Just to give you a couple of things, should I just put it in my pocket?
Yes.
Do you know it goes?
Yeah, you can put it in your pocket.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just to quick the background about me, I'm sure something was already mentioned, something very pompous and impressive, but I don't think I'm anything what was probably written there. But I come from a country called Georgia. I came here to the United States probably around 16 years ago. I was a U.S. State Department fellow. So I moved here to work on my dissertation, and from that point, after I completed my dissertation, I got a job with the American Bar Association. They were looking into the experts to develop the performance indicators for the World Justice Project, basically to measure the progress of the different countries towards greater justice and effectiveness of the criminal justice system. And from that, I got a job at the place called the Vera Institute of Justice, V-E-R-A, Institute of Justice, which is in New York City, has been there for close to 60 years. One of the leading justice policy think tanks in the country. While initially my work there was internationally focused, eventually I started to develop a greater interest in the local prosecution and racial ethnic disparities. The work we did there, we used to call it more technical assistance, and I'll explain what that is rather than research, because at that point, that was now more than 10 years ago, prosecutors were extremely uncomfortable to talk about their race. They're still very uncomfortable now. But to tell them that we're going to come into your office, we're going to collect data, analyze everything, and tell you how you're contributing to racial and ethnic disparities was a very sensitive subject. It still is, but we're electing more and more prosecutors now that bring a different vision for greater fairness, and that is slightly changing. So just to mention, there are two types of prosecutors. We have the federal prosecutors that deal with federal crimes. Many of them are drug trafficking, etc. And there are local prosecutors, county-level prosecutors. There are about 2,500 local prosecutors in the United States. We call them either district attorneys, state attorneys, states attorneys, Commonwealth attorneys. I mean, I think it really varies state by state, but generally they're called DAs, district attorneys. Unlike I think anywhere else, district attorneys in the United States are elected, just like judges and just like the many others in the government. And obviously, there are a lot of arguments to be made in favor of it, to have a lot of independence in your decision making, but also against it. A lot of researchers were arguing when the society, American society, became especially punitive, especially in the 90s. Things were blown out of proportion, and then single cases were shown on TV, and people started to live in fear. A lot of that sentiment was reflected into how prosecutors were messaging their campaigns. So being tough on crime was a very, very popular part of those campaigns, and because it was getting people elected. So being tough on crime also means, putting a lot of people in prisons, many of whom probably should not have gone to prisons because nothing good comes out of it. The punishment has its functions. It cannot be just an emotional thing. You kicked me and I'm going to kick you back, and it's going to make me feel better. I mean, the kids do that. And we sometimes adults do that. When I'm driving, trust me, I have the road rage, I do that. But generally, the criminal justice policies and the government policies should be much sounder than that. So we have to think about what's the benefit of incarcerating you if you were to commit the crime. What is the benefit to the society, benefit to the taxpayer, benefit to the victim, benefit to the communities you represent? So that thinking didn't really happen much. No one really cared about this. You committed the crime, you go to prison. A lot of also sentencing laws we have here, where we like to incarcerate everyone for anything, and just guess who experienced the effect of that disproportionately. It's communities of color, people who live in poverty, and our criminal justice system is grossly still overrepresented by people of color, blacks and Hispanics. So honestly, like, to be, when I first came to the United States, I don't think racial disparity was anything I really cared about. I mean, what did I care? I was like, I'm an immigrant here. People are born here. They should be successful. If they're not successful, it's their fault. I had that mentality. Like, it's not really something that I should be concerned about. I should be concerned about the malaria in parts of Africa, or treatment of women in other parts of the world, etc. Those much more global issues. But then the more I lived here and the more I realized the benefits of being a white guy and also having the educated background, the more I started seeing injustices that can find themselves at every level of our society, whether it's a healthcare, education, the housing, criminal justice, obviously. So we started to partner with, so this is a long story to get to what I meant by technical assistance. So prosecutors didn't like to talk about the racial disparity. Who wants to be told that you're basically racist? We never used that term, but the idea that I would be going and checking your decision making and finding the biased decision making or decisions that were having very negative race consequences, but could not have been explained by legal factors, like kind of crime you committed or prior record, etc. That's not a good conversation to have. So then I tried to convince them that, listen, no one is going to know about this. Let's find the problem within these offices. And if we find the problem, let's find the solution. And if there is a solution, you can go out and take the credit. I was telling the district attorneys, say that, look how committed you are to justice. And if things don't work out, we take the blame. And so but we're not going to get out there and start criticizing you. You can be the one who can say that, I invited this independent group to help me understand racial and ethnic disparities. And we did the analysis. And now these are the possible solutions. And I'm going to commit to implementing those recommendations and hopefully change things for the better. I mean, you can really swing it in your favor, right? So that kind of worked. In most cases, we also said, we don't need to publicize anything. Just deal with the problem. Because prosecutors were not comfortable talking about their data and then publishing the work about racial disparities in the offices. So a lot of things were staying within the offices, behind the closed doors. Because that seemed to be the only way we could do some minimal work to decrease the racial and ethnic disparities in the criminal justice system. I mean, the idea of publishing was so out of question at that point. So it's basically the choice was not doing anything or doing something behind the closed doors and trying to change some prior policies. So they agreed to that. We partnered maybe with 4 or 5 jurisdictions. Things worked out. In some cases, prosecutors were amenable to implementing some of the policy recommendations. At that point, for example, some of the policy recommendations would be like, stop prosecuting drug paraphernalia cases. Just think about it. 10, 12 years ago, that was like, what do you mean I should stop prosecuting drug paraphernalia cases? Society felt that it was that capital, the crime. Or stop prosecuting prostitution cases. We're doing that's public knowledge. We're doing the work in Wisconsin where we saw that most people arrested for prostitution were people of color. And I was like, that's doesn't really make sense. Although I'm a foreigner, even to me it doesn't make sense. So then we looked into it further and we found out, a lot of white people engaged in prostitution were doing it on Craigslist and going to the hotel, so they were not standing on the street, while African American individuals they were on the street, so the neighbors were calling, complaining, the police were going, arresting them. So that was triggering this complete inequality, even who gets detected by the criminal justice apparatus. So we're thinking about different kind of things, how to organize the office in a way that there is a greater oversight over decision making and things like that. At some point, I got sick of doing this work because a lot of times prosecutors then would say like, oh, you spent 2 years doing this analysis. Thank you for that. That's going to stay on the shelf, collect the dust, and we'll see you later. And I like, I don't want to do this anymore. Like, we want to have an impact. It was demoralizing to see there are disparities, and then the office was not buying into the idea of doing something about them. It was really hard. It was hard for me, but I also had like several research associates who were so committed to social justice, and they felt demoralized. And I was like, I promised to them I would never do this again. If the prosecutors are not agreeing to publishing the work and being vocal about the findings, we shouldn't do this work anymore, because it's a huge undertaking to spend 2-3 years, work somewhere, give them the results, give them some ideas how to address the problem, and they're like, no, thanks. It was not something that we found particularly fulfilling. So we then we applied for the funding from the Department of Justice that has the office called National Institute of Justice that funds criminal justice related research. So we put a proposal together that looked into prosecutorial decision making and race, and that was based on the work that was done by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, New York County District Attorney's Office. And I believe some of you may have seen the New York Times coverage of some of that work that looks into where we found the disparities and what are some of the solutions to that. Should I talk about this a little bit, do you think, or not really? So I'll say, first of all, what the study found, and then I'll say what the possible implications may be. So prosecutors make a lot of decisions. They are the most powerful actors of the criminal justice system, but they are least susceptible to public scrutiny. They don't collect data. They don't necessarily like to partner with researchers. They think that the work should be somewhat clandestine, right? It's an investigative sort of the function, and we should make our decisions in our office as fairly as possible, but we don't need to be going out and talking to people about this. At least that is a very traditional view of prosecution. Traditional view of prosecution is not like, let me work with the communities. Let me find the problems. Let me collaborate with other government agencies, civil societies, community groups, and try to think about what we can do about those problems before they become crimes that we have to make arrests on. So that is a kind of the mentality now is sort of emerging, but traditionally, no, you commit a crime, this is the law, this is how long you're going to prison. There is very little sort of the thinking about, okay, what good comes out of it? So we looked into multiple decision points. So the first decision point the prosecutors have, when the police make the arrest, they bring the case to the, let's say, district attorney's office, DA's office. Here it will be state attorney's office. And then there is a reviewing prosecutor, or state attorney, who gets the case, and then the police either verbally or through notes or through emails, through call, whatever the mode might be, tells them, so this is the arrest sheet, this is what we witnessed, this is what we think this should be classified as, so do you want to file charges or not? So the prosecutors then make a decision whether that is a case they should pursue. So they are looking into the evidence. Is it something they can prove? If the case were to go on trial, can you just does it take an only reasonable amount of time to prove it, or it's overwhelming? So if it's something difficult to prove, they're not going to accept it. They are also looking into the other elements of the crime. Was there really the harm? Was there intent? All of those things that make something an offense. So you can hurt somebody, but if you didn't have any sort of mindset that led to it, then you are not necessarily a criminal. The crimes can be intentional or unintentional. You can hurt somebody through negligence, but even that needs to be proven by the state attorney to convict you. So the first decision is to file the case for prosecution or not, what we sometimes call filing charges. And so after that, the person gets basically arraigned, and they're also figuring out whether the person needs to be in pretrial detention or be released while the case is pending. So bail is a big part of it. A lot of people just get bail, and sometimes they post, sometimes they don't post. Guess who is more likely to post bail? White people, people that look just like me, wearing probably the same clothes. They are more likely to post bail. What is the problem with this? It's not only that I'm losing my freedom and I'm losing my relationship with my family and I maybe moved somewhere. Go ahead.
Well, there's additional costs as far as consequences with employers, creditors, a lot of things that people are.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But also just guess, what is the number one strongest predictor of whether you're going to be incarcerated or not as a sentence? Oftentimes it's whether you were in pretrial detention or not. People who are in pretrial detention are by default perceived as more dangerous. So the fact that you cannot post a bail, you end up in pretrial detention. You know, and if I'm a judge and I don't want to take a risk, the person is in pretrial detention. Let me just, I'm more likely to recommend custodial sort of punishment or to sentence you to custodial sentence. So not only it has the social and fiscal other implications, but it also directly influences whether you are going to be sentenced to some jail time or prison time. Your pretrial detention, which shouldn't matter at all. So prosecutors have a lot of power to make recommendation whether to hold somebody in pretrial detention or release. And the release can be on bail or can be on recognizance. Do we know what that is? It basically, you just show that you are a good citizen, you have not committed any crimes, you have community ties, you are not running anywhere, and you are likely to show up in court when you are asked to. So in rare cases that the judges and prosecutors can recommend that and make that happen. So you don't have to post a bail. It doesn't mean if you don't post a bail that you're automatically in pretrial detention, no. But prosecutors are very powerful in terms of arguing the person needs to be in pretrial detention, and sometimes they think that that's part of their job. Getting the most punishment is has been viewed as a very good measure of prosecutorial success. The higher the conviction rate, the longer the prison sentence, the more successful you feel as a prosecutor. At least it has been the case for a long time. The prosecutors have a lot of power over plea negotiations. Do we know what this is? Sorry, go ahead.
Plea negotiations, you talk and consider, you take whether you're guilty or something that nature to avoid a trial. And you make an agreement that you'll get a limited amount of punishment or no punishment at all.
That's exactly right. Generally, people plead guilty not to deal with the criminal justice system to a great extent, go on trial. If you have a good defense counsel, your plea negotiations will be very different from if you have no defense counsel or you're represented by the counsel appointed by the court because you cannot afford a good one. So if you look into the criminal justice data, people who have the private lawyers negotiate the pleas. So it's like buying a house. If I don't know what I'm paying, I'm just going to pay whatever you're asking for because I'm so desperate. I have to get the house, otherwise I'm homeless. Imagine you're in pretrial detention and you feel like you're completely powerless. And you have the prosecutor telling you that, okay, I'm charging you with this. If you agree to plead guilty, I'm giving you 5 years. If you don't agree, you're probably going to get 10 years. So as somebody who knows very little about the criminal justice system and doesn't have a private lawyer, you probably will say 5 years sounds really so much better than 10 years, but you're not thinking you may be actually acquitted, but you don't want to take the chance. I saw the hand there.
Yeah, I'm just curious, my understanding that everyone has the right to an attorney, whether they can afford one or not. Why would they be entering into plea negotiations without?
They don't negotiate a plea, they just plead guilty. Yeah. There is no real plea negotiation in those cases. A lot of people just defend themselves. You can on low-level cases. And so you just say that I'm pleading guilty, whatever it is. There is no negotiation. Pleading guilty doesn't mean plea negotiation at all. Plea negotiation happens when you have the, maybe you are savvy yourself, and let's be honest, a lot of people who are in the system, they know they know their rights. That's the one thing that you are back in the system, you're learning a lot. In prison, you're learning how to, defend yourself. You can go back and push and negotiate.
You mentioned pretrial detention. Even though we have the sneaky clause of the Sixth Amendment,
Yep.
speedy trial clause, I've read and I've heard that that's a problem in our criminal justice system, that people spend an inordinate amount of time in pretrial detention, and that there's really no way for them to petition, or maybe they try, but I hear that that's a big problem. What do you think about that?
Yeah, you cannot do really much about it. I mean, if they determined you are the flight risk and you have a criminal record, you're probably going to be in pretrial detention. You really will be. You don't have much power there. Just imagine you are in prison. I mean, the only chance you have is to come up with the money, hire a good defense attorney. And I don't want to sound like I'm advocating on behalf of the private practice. There are great public defenders, by the way, who do a great job. But know your rights and question whether you are good at it or not, and then try to get help.
Should the criminal justice system be accountable for those held in pretrial detention for an excessive amount of time that violates the Sixth Amendment? That's what I'm wondering.
Don't forget, we incarcerated people for decades for who were falsely accused of crimes. DNA evidence revealed that quite often. Some people were, facing the death penalty. There is nothing the criminal justice system can be punished by, to be honest with you. What is that they can lose, really? I mean, we're talking about a huge system. There's always the finger pointed to somebody else when something goes wrong. But pretrial detention as a default, it's not like we don't need pretrial detention. If somebody commits a crime, you have to go in pretrial detention. If the crime is serious, you are likely not to come to court, and you may even likely to hurt the victim. We need the pretrial detention. Problem with the pretrial detention is it's viewed as a default option as opposed to the alternative. Alternative should be the release. And pretrial detention should be as the last resort when there is a substantial evidence that you may not show up in court and you may even pose risk to a victim. We need that, but that's not how it works. Ultimately, because we elect people and everyone is worried and no one wants to lose their job. You know what do I lose as a judge if you are in my system and I have a choice to release you or not? What if you are released and you hurt somebody, and then there is the headline, newspaper headline saying that the judge released the violent offender who kicked somebody in 2 hours after the release? Like, why would I take that chance? You would take the chance if you're confident and comfortable and you know what's right and you're willing to take the risk. But how many people in our society really do that? We don't do it enough, unfortunately. So then they also make, the prosecutors, another power they have, they make sentencing recommendations. When somebody also is facing incarceration, they can make a recommendation to certain number of years or even to alternatives incarceration. So they have a lot of power. Don't forget, the laws have changed in the last 20 years in a way that judges lost a lot of discretion. Discretion means the exercise of their power. And because initially society perceived judges as biased, unfair, and we need consistency in the application of the law, so the laws became much more rigid. So that a lot of power now were shifted to the prosecutors. Now, as a prosecutor, you can decide, if the case is brought to me, I can decide how to charge the case. It can be a drug possession or it can be a drug sale. You know what? I have all the power. It's not really the judge. And then I can manipulate your sentence based on kind of charge I determined for you. And that's why they're extremely powerful. And in a way, it's not very obvious because everyone thinks like the judges make all the decisions. And it's very easy to see how that may be a misperception because we're thinking of the judiciary, right? So we looked into the treatments of blacks, Hispanics, And so that's another topic to talk about, how you can distinguish between black and Hispanic when somebody can be both. Asians, whites, and others. So basically, we rely on the data that the systems collect. You know, a lot of times, people can be mischaracterized. Their race can be mischaracterized. Because you know, the police officer perceives somebody as Hispanic, and you end up Hispanic in the system. Every time you're arrested, every time your name is entered, Hispanic comes into the system by default. So there is a problem with that, obviously. But you know what? If you are trying to understand the bias or unfair treatment in the criminal justice system, probably the perceived race is what we care about. If you are, I don't know, African American, but I perceive you as Hispanic and therefore I treat you differently, I think that matters for the research question, right? It doesn't matter what you are, really, for that purpose. But you know, we generally have the problem of not accurately recording the race and ethnicity information. And I have few projects right now going on here in Florida and in other states where we're struggling desperately how to capture the ethnicity information accurately. So we looked into the treatment of multiple racial groups across those decision points. So we saw that prosecutor's office accepted almost all cases for prosecution. That was the one interesting finding. 98% of cases. So the whole point of the screening the cases that the police bring to you is to create the system of the sort of checks and balances. That's a different context that you're probably used to hearing that term, that concept. But you know, if the prosecutor's office accepts everything that police do, and every case they bring, there is no check or balance there, right? You are automatically endorsing all the police practices. Some of them can be great, and they are, and some of them can be less so. So if you're accepting all the cases, and there is a possible racial disparities in arrest practices, what does it mean? You're automatically accepting the racially biased practices into your system. You accept all the cases, you didn't do your screening. So another thing we looked into was the plea bargaining. And so prosecutors appear to be especially punitive towards blacks and Hispanics, and they were more likely to make custodial plea offers. So the plea offer can be this kind of charge and can be also this kind of sentence. So as a prosecutor, I can ask from a judge to sentence you to community service, probation, fine, some combination of that, or to a custodial sentence. By custodial sentence, I mean jail or prison term. And so after we accounted for all the factors that we could have, because you can argue some people go to prison because they have committed worse crimes, right? That can be explained by that. Or they have a longer criminal record, way more previous convictions. Or there is a greater harm to a victim, or things like that. So we basically accounted about 20 factors that directly or indirectly may be influencing prosecutorial decisions. Even after accounting for that, we found that blacks and Hispanics were getting recommendation for custodial sentences, and ultimately they were more likely, markedly more likely to be sentenced to prison or jail, after again considering all those factors. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the statistical approach of using regression analysis. So in the statistics, you can compare two things while you can account for the influence of other things. Like, you know, I'm comparing two students in their performance, and then one student is doing better than the other, but that can mean because one student went to college for more years, has more credits, or has greater support at home, while the other student may have to work 3 jobs, like many of us do, or I have done that also. So some of those things can influence the performance. It's the same thing in the criminal justice system. You know, the disparities, some of the disparities can be explained by the nature of the crime, or prior record, or by some other characteristics. But they shouldn't be explained by defendant's race And that's the whole point. Another interesting finding was that defense counsel mattered tremendously. Even when we accounted for the charge seriousness, prior record, other factors, we found that the individuals represented by a private lawyer were more likely to get non-custodial recommendations and sentences. So people who cannot afford private lawyers, in other words, are getting the public defenders. Many of them are great, but maybe not all of them. They're often all getting also court-appointed attorneys. The courts sometimes appoint private attorneys because this defendant can have co-defendants. So if there is a conflict, if there are 3 or 4 defendants involved in a case, the same agency cannot defend everyone, because the idea is that there is a conflict of interest. You cannot do your best to defend your individual client's interest if you have 3 sometimes inconsistent interests. Don't think because there are 3 co-defendants, they all have the same interest in the justice system. They don't. They may have very, very different stakes there involved. So when there is a conflict of interest, the courts appoint the private lawyers. Then generally those are lawyers who are not necessarily super successful. They're working for much, much lower fee. And they have a lot of cases that will take their time, especially that was the case in New York, to prepare for the cases. So the defendants who were represented by court-appointed lawyers had significantly worse outcomes. And so we also know that people who are minorities, racial and ethnic minorities, are more likely to have those court-appointed attorneys or public defenders, as opposed to private lawyers. So racial disparities can start and accumulate as the cases flow through the system, directly or indirectly. You can make a perfectly objective decision, but if you're not considering the decisions made prior to you, you may be contributing to racial disparities. And that's the whole point. If a prosecutor accepts all the cases, or maybe they don't even accept all the cases, they accept the cases objectively, but they are not considering the kind of cases that the police bring to them, they may be contributing to racial and ethnic disparities by default. And they may say, it's not my problem, it's a policing problem. And they do. Oftentimes when you talk to the prosecutors, they say, you know what, those are arrest practices. It's not anything I do in my office. I'm considering the facts of the case and apply the law as strictly as I was trained to do. So those disparities starts with the differential crime rates and then differential policing practices. Obviously, some of that may be accurate, but we don't know to the extent this statement, these defense statements are accurate. So we did this research. There was a lot of pushback on the findings. Don't forget, not many prosecutors had previously partnered with researchers, and we are still extremely grateful to the Manhattan DA's office for making such a bold commitment to committing to publishing things before we even had the findings, and willing to deal with the consequences. So as soon as the study was published, the New York Times picked up on it. They dedicated the New York Times editorial to the policy recommendations, and they covered it a couple of times, and some other outlets. This work is now slightly, not as much as I wish, but is spreading to other jurisdictions also. Here at FIU, we have now several grants that look into prosecutorial decision making. One of the first ones is a project funded by the MacArthur Foundation that looks into how to measure prosecutorial performance. As I mentioned earlier, prosecutors historically have been judged based on how many people they convict, how many trials they won, and how long were the sentences they obtained. Because that was what was going to promote you. And don't tell me that you would not have done the same. You would have, many of you have probably done the same, because that's how system works. And sometimes when you're part of that system, it's very hard to step outside and see what's going on and what you're contributing to. And that can be irrespective of somebody's race or background. You learn very fast once you're sometimes buried into the system. So we want to change that mindset, say that those measures may matter, but that should not be the primary measures. Primary measures should be, what is that the good comes out of your decision making? How much safer are the communities? How much safer people feel being outside, how victims feel about the cases, how fair your decisions are, how much you are engaged with the communities to solve problems. There is a new concept called community prosecution that is now maybe borrowed from the police world, to the community policing, where idea is again to not to wait for things until they are bad. It's just like me knowing that I'm gonna get the cancer and I'm waiting until like I'm really gonna like have no hopes to start thinking about it. But look for symptoms. Go into the communities, develop the relationship, identify the potential problems that later can become the crime. And work with other agencies, government agencies, Department of Health, for example. Work with the local community groups, work with the civil society to try to deal with the problems while they are smaller problems, as opposed to deal with the crimes that our system cannot afford to handle anymore. We have incarcerated way too many people. Our prisons became completely overpopulated. A lot of communities were pretty destroyed, or at least really hurt by removing a lot of human capital from those communities. A lot of young guys, certain communities where every third person in some kind of criminal justice supervision. And that has done a lot of harm, and the researchers have written about this. There is this person called Todd Clear, for example, that has written about the consequences of our obsession with incarceration. And so why can't we look about the other measures? You still need to be tough on crime, but you also need to be smart on crime. Prioritize cases. Not every case deserves the same response. Because if you're dealing with all the cases the same way, then you are spread too thin. We have too many cases to handle. So you cannot really think about which of the criminal cases that got to my office have the greatest public safety return. I cannot prosecute all the cases. The same thing, I cannot develop all my 80 students into the successful scholars. So you always struggle as a professor, like how much attention I should spread versus dedicate to people who may want to contribute to the research or do some meaningful stuff with their lives. So there are, at least it's changing the paradigm a little bit. It really is changing the paradigm where prosecutors are now, we're gathering them together. I'm going to Chicago again next week. We had a big meeting here at FIU where we brought the district attorneys from across the country and the policy experts, where we are having the conversations that just measure the impact you are having, the goodness of your decision. Just don't think you can prosecute this case and therefore you have to accept the case and file the charges. Just think about what's the benefit of filing those charges, because we cannot keep filing charges for every case we can prosecute. So this is the project that is being implemented in 4 jurisdictions. This is Jacksonville, Tampa, both in Florida, as well as in Chicago and Milwaukee. Except for Milwaukee, we have newly elected prosecutors who have campaigned on this new platform of being smart, but responsible also in decision making. And they are very, very much interested in advancing fairness in the criminal justice system. So they were logical partners, and they've been incredible partners. So as part of this project, we're also doing the racial and ethnic disparity assessment for these individual officers. Then we have the project funded by the Koch Foundation that looks into how prosecutorial decision with respect to charges can contribute to sentencing disproportionality. As I said, prosecutors may not be determining the sentences, but they do determine charges. And your charge really ultimately triggers a certain type of sentence. So indirectly, you have a lot of power whether the person goes to prison or jail, and if they do, how long they're going to be there. So the third project that we have is funded by the National Institute of Justice, again, the source that funded the project that I talked about, the race and prosecution in Manhattan. It's a National Institute of Justice funded project that looks into prosecution of hate crimes in Miami. And so we're doing a lot of the case file reviews, and we're doing the surveys with the communities to understand reporting challenges as well as the case processing challenges. I think it's probably to stop here and just like get the questions and hand.
Yeah, would you consider a step forward? I know that in California they ended cash bail.
Yes.
Would that be a step forward towards improving the justice system, or would that be maybe not the right path?
Two things. I mean, you're asking me, so I'll say, yeah, cash bail is a problem because it's always punish the poor. And that doesn't seem right to anyone. I don't think anyone here would think that's a good idea. But you know, it's very easy to say something doesn't work. It's harder to come up with alternatives. Okay, so bail doesn't work right now, and we cannot do that. So what is the alternative? If pretrial detention is not also the right thing, you don't want to eliminate bail and then start sending more people to pretrial detention, because now they cannot be released on their own recognizance. So it's still an experiment, and I'm glad the jurisdictions are experimenting with this. California is the most recent example. New York has been talking about this for a while. They're not ready there yet, but they will get there. But there has to be some better ways to think about how, okay, what are we going to do about these cases? We're just releasing people on recognizance. You know what my worry is, like if a significant number of these people start committing crimes, that can ruin the efforts to decrease the reliance on bail, because that can be a very negative campaigning against it. And that's what I'm worried about. So you release bail, now you are taking higher risks in terms of whom to release without bail, perhaps. And I don't think like $500 ever deterred anyone from committing a crime. But again, I'm making this up. I have not done research about this. But you know, it doesn't seem logical, right? A lot of people are released on bail for $500 bail. Like, you know, if you want to really commit a crime, that's really an incentive. I really don't think so. So I'm very much interested in the consequences of that and how so that the justice system, particularly the court's gonna think about the dealing with the consequences of the decision. I'm also very, very much interested in when that, so the mindset or philosophy is gonna get to Florida. Because Florida generally is more conservative when it comes to the criminal justice practices than it is in California, for example. When is that going to come here so there is a much more meaningful debate around the bail reform? Right now the debate is happening. I'm telling you in front of the camera, but it's as a secret. But it's still happening behind the closed doors, because there is a worry that if I'm thinking about the bail, I may be perceived extremely progressive and that may hurt me. And because there is a perception that society doesn't really support this yet. Societies need to be also educated about the pros and cons, right? You cannot, if you ask random people, they will ask you for, yeah, everyone needs to be executed probably for everything, for speeding. Societies need to be educated. That's going to take the years. But I'm so glad you follow that. That's really impressive. Thank you for that.
This may sound a bit radical, but we already have affirmative action for employment and education. What about mandating guidelines for affirmative action in the criminal justice system so that deviation cannot occur too frequently? Meaning, if the statistics and the average are pointing in one direction, and we're presented with a profile, and this is their classification, that can maybe help us go in the right direction. What do you think?
You know, it sounds extremely radical,
Yeah.
but I don't think it's actually that radical. Some versions of that are being implemented already, or being discussed at least. I'll give you a concrete example. In Chicago, everyone arrested for retail theft, not everyone, but like 90-something%, just gets person of color. A lot of these cases are stealing sandwich or stealing like a low amount of things from the stores. Many of them just to survive, or some kids just, they're simply hungry. And I'm saying here that I'm not saying that's what anyone should do. That is fundamentally wrong. Even if you're hungry, you have to figure out how to feed yourself without stealing. That's fundamentally wrong. But if I'm only getting the people of color for the same offense, is this really something that I should be prosecuting? Or this is really the social services problem or some other agency's problem? or the child welfare problem, or some other problems that society wants the criminal justice system to deal with. But it's not a criminal justice problem. It may become a criminal justice problem, but the criminal justice system is not equipped to deal with this. That's a problem. Everyone, society wants a lot of solutions from the criminal justice system and from the police. Sometimes we're being unfair how much we want from the criminal justice system. Every time a kid doesn't go to school, or somebody speeds, or somebody trespasses, or somebody dumps the garbage, or somebody does craziest thing, we call the police. We want them to show up and deal with that. And you know, that mentality also, what are they going to do when they show up? What can they do? They cannot just feed the homeless. They will have to take this person to the station and deal with that. So I think responsibility here falls on everyone, really. You know, on every community, including communities of color, especially on the white communities, to realize what we have done and how we can remedy that. Responsibility falls on the criminal justice system, but also on the government, other government agencies. And then, you know, civil society and community groups are also very, very powerful. They get funding, and we need to empower them to do more good, for sure. Good question. Anyone? Come on, people.
I think we pretty much used up.
Oh, we used. Okay.
I think that's it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Produced by Academic Video Services within the Division of Information Technology at Florida International University.